Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are taking a seriously fascinating journey through the world of finance. We're going from the staggering, completely uncontrollable chaos of global macroeconomics, all the way down to the highly controllable and honestly empowering math of your own personal savings. We're going to see exactly how these massive systemic issues eventually trickle down to our daily lives, and more importantly, how you can build an absolute fortress against them.
Okay, let's dive right in. We've got a lot to cover today, mapping out this wild journey from the insane $38 trillion macro-level crisis all the way down to the $10,000 personal micro-level shield. Starting off with the big picture, the national debt crisis and our $38 trillion reality. To really understand personal finance, we first have to understand the environment we're operating in. Just look at this mind-bending figure, $38 trillion. That is the current U.S. national debt. The reality is, the United States has been running like an unprofitable business since 2001. And since 2020, we've been running a nearly $2 trillion annual deficit. That literally means the government is spending almost $2 trillion more than it collects every single year, just borrowing the difference to keep the lights on. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly where all that money is going. Just 5 line items eat up nearly 70% of the entire federal budget. We're talking Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, national defense, and net interest on the debt. Everything else is kind of just pocket change. People often argue about cutting foreign aid to balance the budget, but foreign aid is literally just 1%. If we cut it to absolutely zero, it would only fund about 19 days of Social Security payments. So to fix the deficit, you absolutely have to look at the massive slices of this pie. Which brings us to those untouchable government giants: Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. These are the mandatory spending programs locked in by law. They are basically the Mount Everest of our budget challenges, making up $3 trillion annually. Now, Social Security is projected to reach insolvency by 2034, which by law would trigger an automatic 20% cut to benefits. A potential mathematical fix for this: lifting the cap on payroll taxes so earnings above $170,000 are taxed. Medicare faces a really similar cliff, with insolvency projected for 2033 and an automatic 11% cut. A potential fix here involves raising the standard 2.9% Medicare payroll tax by just 1 point, or maybe addressing the estimated 22 to 39% overpayments made to private Medicare Advantage plans. The options definitely exist, but they require significant legislative action. Now, let's shift gears a bit and look at opportunism in the consumer market, specifically the Uncle Don smartphone illusion. When the macro environment is this chaotic, it often bleeds into the consumer market, creating these crazy opportunities where political narratives get monetized. To illustrate this, our sources look at a recent venture in the banana economy, known as the Uncle Don smartphone. This venture was hyped up as a cutting edge, made in the US jungle device, and based entirely on the strength of that narrative, fans just lined up in droves. We're talking 590,000 deposits made at 100 bananas each. That equals $59 million sitting in a company account before a single phone ever shipped, or was even fully finalized, for that matter. Now, what's really interesting here is the stark contrast between what was promised and reality. Analysts quickly found that the Dawn smartphone, marketed at 499 bananas with a vague Snapdragon 7 series chip and Android 15, was actually almost a one-to-one copy of a Chinese smartphone called the Winge Revel 7 Pro, and that one retails for just 169 bananas. Plus, the FCC certification came from a private label electronics outfit, not the brand itself. Shortly after these comparisons surfaced, the whole "made in the US" claim just quietly vanished from the product's website. This confusion behind the scenes was immediately reflected in the product's totally erratic rollout. The original launch was slated for August 2025. Then it got pushed to October, and then delayed again to January 2026, officially citing a federal government shutdown as the reason. By April 2026, amidst constantly shifting screen sizes on their promotional materials and some security breaches on their pre-order page, the release date was just removed from the website entirely. Poof, gone. Which leads us to this truly remarkable update. About 10 months into collecting those deposits, this exact quote was quietly added to the terms and conditions. Making a deposit does not guarantee that a device will be produced or made available for purchase. Wow. Legal analysts noted that this move essentially transformed that $59 million in deposits into a massive, no interest, no strings attached loan from everyday retail consumers right to the company. This perfectly sets up our next segment on crypto, tariffs, and consumer traps. Basically, the illusion of patriotism for profit. You see, this smartphone venture didn't just happen in a vacuum. It highlights a much broader business environment where consumer hype and political branding intersect, often leaving the retail buyer holding the bag. The sources point out a pretty fascinating contradiction in how manufacturing policy was applied. On one hand, a tech giant like Apple bypassed heavy 25% tariffs simply by arguing that U.S. manufacturing infrastructure didn't exist at scale, a waiver that was seemingly smoothed over by a $1 million banana donation to an inauguration fund. Meanwhile, the Uncle Don venture was simultaneously claiming to have easily achieved that exact Made in America manufacturing miracle before, quietly dropping the claim. It's a really stark look at how rules can bend depending on exactly who is navigating them. And we see a very similar pattern over in the crypto space. The Don meme coin launched at 1.21 bananas, absolutely spiked to 73 bananas within 48 hours, fueled entirely by hype and branding, and then just crashed right back down to around 2 bananas today. Forensic analysis revealed an incredible disparity here. Retail investors collectively lost $2 billion in this trade, while associated insiders quietly collected around $100 million in trading fees. It is a harsh but real reminder of the massive dangers hidden inside hype-driven consumer traps. All right, let's move away from the chaos and see how this all builds to the $10,000 shield, taking control of your own microeconomy. We've spent this explainer looking at trillion-dollar deficits and billion-dollar market illusions, things you and I absolutely cannot control. Now, let's talk about what you actually can control. When you hit $10,000 in personal savings, you trigger what financial experts call the emergency fund effect. And it's not actually about spending that money on emergencies. It's about the profound psychological peace of mind of just knowing it's there. Neuroscientists have actually found that this level of financial security literally lowers your cortisol levels. It changes your brain chemistry. You stop playing constant defense, and you finally start looking for opportunities. Practically speaking, having $10,000 entirely changes the reality of your daily life. Think about it. A car repair without savings, that is a countdown to financial disaster. But with $10,000 saved, it's just a simple, mild inconvenience. If you lose your job with zero savings, you are desperate. You have to accept the very first terrible offer you get. With $10,000, you've got 3 to 6 months of breathing room to find the right job. You might even gladly spend $50 to attend a networking event you otherwise would have skipped, potentially landing a role that pays thousands more. It just fundamentally changes your relationship with risk. Having this financial shield also completely eliminates something called decision fatigue. When you're living paycheck to paycheck, you are forced to make thousands of exhausting microdecisions based strictly on survival. Like constantly calculating if you can afford name-brand pasta over the generic one. Reaching that $10,000 mark makes 90% of those daily survival calculations totally irrelevant. It frees up an immense amount of mental bandwidth, allowing you to actually think strategically about your future rather than just reacting to the next crisis. Which brings us to our final step, developing the saver identity and shifting your financial mindset.
So, the crucial point is, how do we actually build this shield? Well, the hardest part isn't necessarily saving the money, it's developing the identity of a saver. You want to start incredibly small, maybe just $25 or $50 a month. But don't treat it like some temporary financial diet. Treat it as becoming a whole new type of person. Look, saving your first $1,000 is brutal. It requires massive willpower. But by the time you hit your fifth $1,000, it's virtually automatic. You begin to realize that the absolute most important skill in wealth building isn't earning money, it's keeping money. You stop seeing cash as something that just vanishes, and you start treating it as a tool that actively multiplies your options in life.
And that brings us to our final thought for today. We live in a world defined by $38 trillion national deficits that honestly seem impossible to solve, alongside flashy consumer traps meticulously designed to separate you from your hard-earned cash. The macro world out there is pure, unadulterated chaos. But your micro world, it doesn't have to be. So I want to leave you with this question. In a world of trillion-dollar deficits and billion-dollar grifts, who will you become to protect your first $10,000? Build your shield, take control of your microeconomy, and completely change your financial reality. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this info empowers you to take that next big step.